Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about impactful introductions. We're going to do this by talking about some of our opening considerations, and then we're going to get into some impactful opening strategies. So, why do I keep on hitting on impactful openings? If you look at the rubric, you'll notice that over 50% of every single one of the speeches rubrics comes from that impactful opening. As you know by now, a good introduction, it's going to capture an audience's attention, and a bad introduction, well, we're already gone, we're on our phones, and we're not paying attention. Our length of a good introduction is going to be about 10 to 15% of our speech. For the informative speech, we're looking at 5 to 6 minutes. So that should be between about 50 seconds to about a minute and a half, but anything longer than that's going to be too much. And then we're also going to think of some considerations. I want you to think about the appropriateness or relevance to the audience, the purpose of the speech, the topic, and the occasion. So let's kind of break down this audience relevance. Well, the fact of the matter is that if I was talking to an audience of my parents' age and they're in their 80s, I really have to know about my audience, to know their backgrounds, to really think about what's appropriate to them. Different audiences will have different backgrounds, they'll have different knowledge. If I'm talking about AI to my parents, well, I'm going to have to break that down a lot more than if I'm talking with maybe more college age or high school age students who maybe use it a little bit more often. So you really want to think about your audience. A great example of this is a few years ago, I had a student who was going to talk about net neutrality for their informative speech, but the audience had no idea what it was. And so he had to make sure that he gave that background information. You want to think about the purpose of the speech. We've talked about four basic purposes that you can have for giving a speech: to inform, to persuade, to entertain, or to honor. Sometimes that gets broken down to three: to entertain, persuade, or inform. And of course, sometimes I say the only reason we ever open our mouth is to change the world, which is persuasion. But you have to think about your audience and what you're going to do. If you're trying to entertain your audience, well, you probably don't want to start off with the malnutrition numbers of a county in California. That's probably not a great way to entertain them. So you want to think about how to prepare your audience for your speech. If your attention getter differs drastically from the rest of your speech, it may cause disjointedness, and your audience could become confused or just tune you out completely. You want to make sure that your impactful opening has that connection to the speech. We don't want to have a bait and switch like this poor little puppy has gotten, right? Ideally, your attention getting devices should have relevant connection to your speech. Imagine if a speaker just pulled out condoms out of his pocket and yelled free sex through the condoms at the audience at the beginning of the speech, and then went on to talk about, oh, I don't know, tax codes in Georgia. That would be really weird. That would be quite the bait and switch like we see right here. And then, of course, there's tone. Well, what exactly is tone? Tone is the expression of a mood or emotion. In public speaking, it's used to describe how a speaker's attitude and the audience perceives the overall message. Think about AI. If I'm talking about it with a series of students, I might have a different mood about AI than when I'm talking about it with other professors, because we are seeing it as a little bit of an issue. The length, as I had mentioned, should only be about 10 to 15% of your speech. So this speech, 60 seconds to 90 seconds, should be about it. So let's start breaking down into some of those impactful introduction openings. Well, the first one is something you probably do every day for essays, right? You want to have that reference to the subject. That way, the audience is going to know exactly what we're going to be talking about. There's never going to be any confusion from the audience. Okay, we're talking about statistics. Today, we're surrounded by statistical information in today's world. So understanding statistics is becoming paramount to citizenship in the 21st century. Well, I can tell you right now what the speech is about. Now, there might be a reference to the audience. As students, we're often overwhelmed with multiple responsibilities, leading to higher stress levels. Today, I'm going to talk about stress reducing techniques. Again, get right to the heart of it, but make it important to that audience connection. That's what is in it for them. Now, this is actually one of my favorite ones, a reference to a current event. Think about what are some things that might be happening today. Go open up Google News, go open up front page of Reddit, and there's always all sorts of current events, different environmental events, political events, pop culture events. These can be excellent ways to capture the audience attention. I remember I had one student who was doing an informative speech on vaccinations and started her speech referencing a popular song that was actually talking about alcoholic shots, but it starts shot, 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 shots, if you know what song I'm talking about. But immediately it grabbed that audience's attention with this current song, this pop song, but also made this great connection to her topic. Now, we could talk about current events, but we could also talk about historical references. A historical reference is closely linked to that current event. However, instead of immediately bringing to mind a current issue, it may invoke the imagination to remind your audience the importance of historical events and how those events still impact us today. There's anecdotes. So, what do I say an anecdote is? I always say it's a brief story, a true story, or a fable. I really like to focus on kind of things that can't be proven, things that you don't absolutely know are true. Maybe Jack and Jill is a true story, you're pretty sure, so it's more of an anecdote. However, that's a little different than personal reference, something that you know is true or your experience. And remember to be careful about your personal experience and your personal knowledge. If you become emotional during your speech and lose your composure, the audience may become uncomfortable. On the other hand, I've also seen the audience find that even more empathetic and find themselves connecting with the speaker more. So it's really specific to the context. Impactful quotations is always a wonderful way to open a speech. Albert Einstein said, "Every day I remind myself that my inner and outer lives are based on the labors of other men, living and dead, and that I must exert myself in order to give in the same measure as I have received and I'm still receiving." But not all quotations do we know who said it. So what if there's an unknown source? For example, a really popular quotation that we use here in San Francisco is, "The coldest winter I ever spent was my summer in San Francisco." However, there's no real proof that Mark Twain said that. Same with golf is a good walk spoiled, and beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy. So you might interject that particular phrase in there. You might say, "It's reported to have that Winston Churchill said," or some people have suggested that Mark Twain's favorite quote about San Francisco is this. But just giving it that little bit of separation between the speaker and the quote can keep your credibility, which is really what's important here. Of course, a lot of us love our questions when we're opening a speech. And I always love when we're doing a live action to make sure that you tell your audience what you want them to do. So if it's a response question, you could say, "Please raise your hand if you've ever thought about backpacking in Europe." If the audience knows what they need to do, you're not going to have somebody who tries to answer the question and take you off course. You as a speaker will either get a bunch of hands up, or maybe you say nod, or maybe you say stand up if you thought about this. But you as a speaker know what you're expecting in return from your audience. And this can be powerful, especially when you see all those people stand up. Now, the other type of question is a rhetorical question. This is one where no response is expected. But I warn you all, make sure that you still tell your audience what you want them to do. I'd like you to think about two questions. Imagine if you were born the opposite gender. Don't expect your audience to be able to read your mind and know what you want. Make sure you tell them what to do. Clear is kind. Now, of course, my absolute favorite way to open any speech is startling statement. This can really grab your audience attention. It could be something like shocking information. It takes 660 gallons of water to make one hamburger. One hamburger. And in California, when we so often are going through a drought, this is a big deal. Could be my strange fact that I love to tell everybody. Contrary to popular belief, men can lactate. The last time that was documented that I researched was back in 2002 in Nepal, when a young father who had lost his wife and his daughter's mother in childbirth needed to get his infant child to take the nipple of formula, but could not get her to take it without actually putting her on his own nipple. Well, eventually he started to produce mother's milk and he actually began to lactate. It's kind of fascinating, right? Of course, I had a student a few years ago who knew somebody could do it as a party trick in high school. So, probably not the last time it was happening. And then, of course, there's surprising statistics. As of 2025, there are 13 Black billionaires in the US, and this is compared with about 587 white billionaires. Think about that huge disparity. And then there's always so silence can really grab people's attention. I'm going to guess that a couple of you who may be off looking at your cell phone or playing with your dog or whatever is going on at home while you're watching this, maybe turned back to the screen and wondered why there was no sound. Because it can be powerful. As an experiment, Mark Twain once walked out on stage and just stared at the audience, saying nothing. For perhaps 3 minutes, he looked around the room and the tension built as the audience wondered what was happening. Finally, the silence was just too much for a woman who just burst out laughing. And soon she was followed by others laughing, and hundreds of people were laughing. And Mark Twain stood silent, completely staring at them. In 1952, American composer John Cage composed a 3-part movement called 4 minutes and 33 seconds, in which the score instructs the performers not to play their instruments. Nobody plays a thing during the entire piece. The piece consists of the sounds of the environment that the listener hears while it's performed, although it's commonly perceived as 4 minutes, 33 seconds of silence. How many of us are guilty of always having our earbuds in, always having music playing, always hearing dog barking? Silence can be an amazing break from the noise that we constantly hear and can be very impactful. You may recognize this next speaker. We've seen them speak a few times in this class. This is X Gonzalez and one of the March for Our Lives speeches that they gave. Now, I'm going to fast forward through part of it and you'll see why.
6 minutes and about 20 seconds. In a little over 6 minutes, 17 of our friends were taken from us, 15 were injured, and everyone, absolutely everyone, in the Douglas community was forever altered. Everyone who was there understands. Everyone who has been touched by the cold grip of gun violence understands. For us, long, tearful, chaotic hours in the scorching afternoon sun were spent not knowing. No one understood the extent of what had happened. No one could believe that there were bodies in that building waiting to be identified for over a day. No one knew that the people who were missing had stopped breathing long before any of us had even known that a code red had been called. No one could comprehend the devastating aftermath or how far this would reach or where this would go. For those who still can't comprehend because they refuse to, I'll tell you where it went. Right into the ground, 6 feet deep. 6 minutes and 20 seconds with an AR-15, and my friend Carmen would never complain to me about piano practice. Aaron Feist would never call Kira Miss Sunshine. Alex Schachter would never walk into school with his brother Ryan. Scott Beagle would never joke around with Cameron at camp. Helen Ramsey would never hang out after school with Max. Gina Montalto would never wave to her friend Liam at lunch. Joaquin Oliver would never play basketball with Sam or Dylan. Elena Petty would never. Carol Lugren would never. Chris Hickson would never. Luke Hoyer would never. Marquine Duque Aguiano would never. Peter Wang would never. Alyssa Al-Hadaf would never. Jamie Guttenberg would never. Meadow Pollock would never.
Like Mark Twain, you can hear the audience start to react. They're so silent.
Since the time that I came out here, it has been 6 minutes and 20 seconds. The shooter has ceased shooting and will soon abandon his rifle, blend in with the students as they escape, and walk free for an hour before arrest. Fight for your lives before it's someone else's job.
I have to tell you, I couldn't even imagine being in front of that large of a crowd and not saying anything for that long. So what did we talk about? We talked about different impactful openings. We talked about references to subject, to the audience, historical, current events. We talked about anecdotes, quotations, questions, startling statements, personal experiences or references, and then finally, as we craft our next two speeches, I want you to really think about what opening would work best with your speeches. When we grab their attention immediately, it can be amazing. Reach out if you have any questions.